I was holding my brother's hand when something that looked exactly like him walked out of the forest from the opposite direction, and both versions of Jake turned to look at me with identical expressions of confusion and fear, and I realized with absolute bone-chilling certainty that one of them was not my brother at all, but something wearing his face. Something that had been following us through the New Mexico wilderness for the past 3 days. Something that the Navajo elders had warned us about, but that we had dismissed as superstitious nonsense until this very moment, when I had to choose which brother to trust, and knowing that choosing wrong would mean death or worse. The thing that was not Jake smiled at me with teeth that seemed just slightly too white, too perfect, and its eyes caught the late afternoon sunlight in a way that made them shine like an animal's eyes reflecting a flashlight beam, and it spoke in Jake's voice, but the words came out wrong, the cadence off by just a fraction, like someone doing an impression of my brother rather than actually being him. The real Jake, or what I desperately hoped was the real Jake, grabbed my arm and pulled me backward, his hand cold and trembling, his breath coming in quick panicked gasps, and he was saying something about running, about getting to the truck, about not looking back no matter what we heard, but I was frozen, unable to move, unable to process what I was seeing because my rational mind insisted this was impossible, that there could not be two identical versions of my brother standing 15 feet apart in a clearing in the high desert forest, that skinwalkers were just stories told to scare tourists and keep children from wandering too far from home. But 3 days ago, I would have said the same thing about a lot of what had happened on this cursed camping trip, would have laughed at anyone who suggested that ancient Native American curses were real or that creatures from folklore actually existed in the modern world, would have dismissed the warnings we received in that small trading post as the ramblings of old people trying to preserve dying traditions through fear and manipulation. 3 days ago, I was a different person, a college student on spring break exploring the Southwest with my younger brother, armed with GPS and cell phones, and the absolute confidence of someone who had never encountered anything that couldn't be explained by science and reason, who had never seen proof that the world contained mysteries deeper and darker than what appeared in textbooks and Wikipedia articles. Let me start from the beginning, from the moment we arrived in Shiprock, New Mexico, because that's when the first strange thing happened, the first hint that we were entering territory where the normal rules didn't apply, where our modern certainty and technological advantages would mean nothing against forces that predated human civilization and operated according to logics we could not compare. Jake and I had driven from Phoenix, where we both attended university, taking spring break as an opportunity to explore the Four Corners region, camping and hiking and photographing the dramatic landscapes that made this area famous, following an itinerary I had carefully researched and planned over months of preparation. Jake was 21, and I was 24, close enough in age that we had always been friends as well as siblings, and this trip was partly about adventure and partly about spending time together before Jake graduated and potentially moved away for graduate school or work. We arrived in Shiprock on a Tuesday afternoon, the distinctive rock formation that gave the town its name rising from the desert like a massive ship frozen in stone, and we stopped at a trading post on the edge of town to buy supplies and get information about good camping spots in the area. The trading post was run by an elderly Navajo woman named Mrs. Begay, who looked at us with eyes that seemed to see more than just two college kids with backpacks and cameras. And when Jake mentioned that we were planning to camp in the Chuska Mountains for several days, her expression changed, becoming grave and concerned in a way that made me uncomfortable. She asked us which specific area we intended to camp in, and when I showed her the location on my map, a remote valley about 15 miles from the nearest road, she shook her head slowly and told us in careful English that we should choose a different location, that the place we had selected was not safe, that there were things in those mountains that did not welcome outsiders, and that would harm us if we intruded on their territory. I thanked her for the concern, but explained that we were experienced campers, that we knew how to handle wildlife and extreme weather, that we had all the proper equipment, and would take appropriate safety precautions, basically dismissing her warning as the kind of vague danger talk that locals often use to discourage tourists from visiting certain areas. Mrs. Begay studied me for a long moment, then turned to Jake and spoke directly to him, her voice dropping lower, becoming more urgent, telling him that this was not about bears or mountain lions or getting lost, that there were skinwalkers in those mountains, witches who could take the form of animals or people, who could run faster than any human, who could read thoughts and mimic voices, and who fed on human fear and suffering. Jake, who had taken a Native American Studies course the previous semester and fancied himself somewhat knowledgeable about indigenous cultures, responded with what he probably thought was respectful interest, asking questions about the Skinwalker legends and their place in Navajo cosmology, treating the warning as an anthropological curiosity rather than a genuine danger. And I could see Mrs. Begay's frustration growing as she realized we were not taking her seriously, that we viewed our culture's beliefs as folklore rather than reality. She finally stopped trying to convince us, and instead performed what looked like a blessing or protection ritual, speaking in Navajo, while sprinkling something that might have been corn pollen on our hands and foreheads, and she gave us a small leather pouch filled with herbs and other materials, instructing us to keep it with us at all times, to hang it outside our tent at night, to burn some of the contents in our campfire each evening, and absolutely never, under any circumstances, to whistle after dark or to respond if we heard our names being called from the forest when we could not see who was calling. We accepted the pouch with thanks that were probably more patronizing than genuine, paid for our supplies, and continued on our way, laughing a bit in the truck about superstitious locals and how every remote area seemed to have its own version of monsters in the woods designed to scare away outsiders. I feel sick with guilt now remembering that laughter, remembering how casually we dismissed warnings that came from generations of knowledge and experience, how arrogantly we assumed that our education and modern worldview made us smarter than people who had lived on this land for thousands of years. We drove the 15 miles of increasingly rough road until we could go no further in the truck, then shouldered our packs, and hiked another 6 miles into the mountains, reaching the valley I had selected just before sunset on that first day. The location was perfect according to my research, a hidden meadow surrounded by ponderosa pines with a clear stream running through it, and rock formations that would provide windbreaks and interesting photography opportunities. And as we set up camp, that first evening everything seemed ideal, the weather mild, the scenery spectacular, no signs of other campers or any human presence at all. Jake wanted to explore immediately, but I insisted we finish setting up camp first, establish our base properly before dark, and by the time we had the tent up and our supplies organized and a fire going, the sun had set and the forest had grown dark around us with a speed that seemed unnatural, as if night fell more quickly here than in other places. We ate dinner by firelight, rehydrated camping meals that tasted better than they had any right to, and we talked about our plans for the next few days, the hikes we would take, the photographs we would capture, the adventure we would have in this pristine wilderness, and neither of us noticed at first that the normal sounds of a forest at night were absent, no insects chirping, no animals moving through the underbrush, no birds settling into their roosts, just an unnatural silence that pressed in on our small circle of firelight like something physical. Jake noticed it first, commenting that it was unusually quiet, and I agreed but suggested it might be because we were at relatively high elevation, around 8,000 feet, and maybe the animal activity was different here than in the lower desert areas we were used to. We decided to turn in early since we had been traveling all day, and as I was banking the fire and Jake was brushing his teeth at the stream, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a sound like Jake's voice calling my name from somewhere in the forest, but Jake was right there at the stream only 30 feet away. I could see him in the light from my headlamp, and the voice was coming from the opposite direction, from deeper in the trees, where the darkness was absolute. I called out to Jake, asking if he had said something, and he turned toward me with his toothbrush still in his mouth, shaking his head in confusion, and I told him I thought I heard someone calling my name. He spit out his toothpaste and listened, and we both heard it again, my name spoken in a voice that sounded exactly like Jake's voice, coming from the darkness beyond our camp. And Jake went pale even in the dim light, remembering Mrs. Begay's warning about not responding to voices calling from the forest. We hurried into the tent and zipped it closed, suddenly feeling very vulnerable in our thin nylon shelter, and Jake pulled out the leather pouch Mrs. Begay had given us, hanging it from the tent's ceiling loop where she had instructed it should go, and neither of us spoke about what we had heard, both trying to convince ourselves there was a rational explanation, maybe another camper playing a prank, maybe some acoustic trick of the landscape making sounds carry strangely, maybe our tired minds, creating patterns out of random noise. Sleep was difficult that first night, every small sound outside the tent making us tense and alert, and several times I thought I heard footsteps circling our camp, heavy footsteps that did not sound like any animal I was familiar with, footsteps that would stop whenever I held my breath to listen more carefully, as if whatever was out there knew I was paying attention and was being cautious. Toward dawn, I finally fell into an exhausted sleep and woke a few hours later to find Jake already up and out of the tent, making coffee over a rebuilt fire, acting as if nothing strange had happened, determinately normal in the way people are when they are trying not to think about something frightening. We spent that second day hiking and taking photographs, exploring the valley and the surrounding ridges, and in the daylight, it was easy to dismiss the previous night's experiences as imagination and fatigue, easy to appreciate the beauty of the landscape and feel foolish for being scared by shadows and sounds. But as the afternoon wore on, I began to notice things that troubled me, small details that did not quite fit, like the complete absence of animal tracks anywhere we walked despite the soft earth near the stream that should have been covered with deer and elk prints, like the trees that had claw marks high up their trunks, far higher than any AR could reach, marks that looked like they had been made by something climbing or possibly by something much larger than should exist. Jake found a dead raven lying in the path, its body intact with no visible injuries, just dead for no apparent reason, and when he picked it up to examine it more closely, the bird's body was ice cold despite lying in direct sunlight, cold in a way that seemed to radiate outward, making Jake's hands ache with the chill, and he dropped it quickly, wiping his hands on his pants as if the bird had contaminated him. We returned to camp earlier than planned, both of us feeling uneasy in ways we did not want to articulate, and as we prepared dinner, I remembered Mrs. Begay's instruction to burn some of the contents from the leather pouch in our fire each evening. I opened the pouch and found a mixture of dried herbs and what looked like sage and cedar, along with some kind of ground stone or mineral, and I sprinkled a pinch into the flames, which immediately flared up bright and hot, burning with colors that fire should not produce, blues and greens mixed with the normal orange and yellow, and the smoke that rose from it smelled sharp and clean, almost medicinal, and I felt slightly better, slightly safer, as if the smoke was creating a barrier around our camp. That second night was worse than the first, the sound starting earlier and growing bolder, footsteps circling our tent, voices calling our names in perfect imitations of each other's voices, Jake's voice calling for me and my voice calling for Jake, trying to lure us out of the tent. And once I heard what sounded like our mother's voice, which was impossible since she was over 500 miles away in Phoenix. But the voice was perfect, exactly her tone and inflection, calling for us to come help her, saying she was hurt and scared and needed us. Jake started crying when he heard that, his hand gripping mine inside our shared sleeping bag. Both of us terrified children again, despite being grown adults. Both of us knowing intellectually that our mother was not out there in the New Mexico wilderness, but unable to fully resist the emotional pull of her voice calling for help. The sounds continued until almost dawn, sometimes voices and sometimes other noises, scratching at the tent fabric, heavy breathing just outside the thin nylon walls, and once a sound like something very large moving through our camp, knocking over our cooking equipment and scattering our supplies. But when dawn came, and we finally gathered the courage to unzip the tent and look outside, nothing was disturbed. Everything was exactly where we had left it, as if the sounds had been hallucinations, or shared delusions rather than real events. We should have left then, should have packed up and hiked back to the truck and driven away from those cursed mountains. but pride and stubbornness, and maybe some kind of masculine refusal to admit fear kept us there, kept us insisting to each other that we were not going to let superstition and imagination ruin our trip, that we had planned this adventure for months, and we were going to see it through. So we stayed for a third day, and that was when things went from frightening to genuinely dangerous, when the presence that had been toying with us decided to escalate, to show us that it was not content with just scaring us, but intended to do real harm. We decided to take a longer hike that third day, following the stream up toward its source in the higher elevations, and about 2 hours from camp we saw our first clear evidence that we were not alone in these mountains. A footprint in the mud beside the stream, a print that looked almost human, but was too large, too elongated, with claw marks at the tips of the toes, and the print was fresh. The edges still sharp, and not yet dried in the sun. Jake wanted to photograph it, and I did, taking multiple shots from different angles, documenting evidence that would later be dismissed as a hoax or misidentification, but that in the moment filled us with dread because we both knew we were looking at something that should not exist. We continued hiking, but now with constant vigilance, scanning the forest around us, and I began to notice that we were being paralleled, something moving through the trees keeping pace with us but staying out of direct sight, occasionally visible as a dark shape flitting between trunks, moving with a fluid grace that was definitely not human despite the roughly human silhouette. Jake saw it too, and we picked up our pace, not quite running but walking as fast as the terrain allowed, and the thing in the forest matched our speed, sometimes ahead of us and sometimes behind, toying with us, making sure we knew it was there. And I thought about predators, about how cats will play with prey before killing it, will let mice run and then catch them again, over and over, enjoying the fear and the chase more than the actual killing. We were being hunted, I realized, had been marked as prey from the moment we entered this valley, and all the sounds and voices over the previous nights had been the hunter learning about us, studying us, preparing for this moment when it would finally strike. We ran then, abandoning any pretense of casual hiking, just running as fast as we could back toward camp, and behind us we could hear it following, no longer bothering to hide, crashing through undergrowth and leaping over obstacles, and the sounds it made were not quite animal and not quite human, but something in between, grunting and growling mixed with sounds that might have been laughter or might have been something worse. We reached camp gasping and terrified, and I immediately started packing our gear, throwing things into bags without organization, just desperate to leave, to get out of this valley, and back to the truck, and back to civilization where things made sense and ancient curses were just stories. Jake helped me pack, and we were ready to go. In less than 10 minutes, abandoning items that were not essential, leaving our tent standing because taking it down would have cost precious time, and we shouldered our packs and started hiking out, moving as fast as possible while still following the trail markers I had placed on the hike in. We had gone maybe half a mile when Jake said he needed to stop for water. His pack was cutting into his shoulders wrong, and he needed to adjust it, and I told him we could not stop. We had to keep moving, but he insisted, and I reluctantly agreed to a 2-minute break. He shrugged off his pack and was bent over adjusting the straps when I saw movement in the forest to our left, and I grabbed Jake's arm to warn him, and that's when it stepped out from behind a tree about 50 yards away, and I got my first clear look at the thing that had been stalking us. It was shaped roughly like a human, walking upright on 2 legs, but it was too tall, maybe 7 feet, and its proportions were wrong. Limbs too long and joints that bent at angles that human joints could not achieve, and it was covered in what might have been fur or might have been something else, dark and matted and filthy, and its head was the worst part, because it was not quite a human head, and not quite an animal head, but a horrible amalgamation of both, a human face stretched over something else, with eyes that glowed yellow in the shadows, and a mouth that had too many teeth, and it was wearing clothes, or what remained of clothes, tattered pieces of fabric that might once have been jeans and a shirt, as if this thing had once been human or wanted us to think it might be. It tilted its head while looking at us, a gesture that was eerily human-like, curious and calculating, and then it smiled, And that smile was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen because it was knowing, intelligent, showing that this was not just an animal but something with consciousness and intent and malevolence. Jake grabbed my hand and we ran, leaving his pack behind, just running in blind panic, and I could hear it following, but it was not running at full speed. It was loping along casually, letting us exhaust ourselves, and I knew that when we could run no more it would catch us easily and do whatever it intended to do from the beginning. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like they would give out when we suddenly broke out of the forest into a clearing, and there standing in the middle of the clearing was Jake, looking confused and frightened, calling my name and asking where I had gone, and I was still holding the hand of who I thought was Jake, and that's when I realized I was actually holding the hand of the creature that had been chasing us, and I looked to my right, and saw that what I thought was my brother's hand in mine was actually something else, something with skin that was too dry and too cold and fingernails that were too long and too sharp, and I screamed and pulled away and stumbled toward the Jake in the clearing. But then I saw that the Jake I had been holding was changing, its form rippling and shifting, becoming more obviously inhuman, and the Jake in the clearing was also changing, his features distorting, and I realized with absolute horror that neither of them was my real brother, that the Skinwalker had somehow taken Jake while we were running, had replaced him, or copied him, or done something that resulted in two fake Jakes, and no real one, and I was alone with this creature that could wear my brother's face like a mask. Both figures were transforming now, shedding the pretense of humanity, revealing the thing underneath, and I stood frozen in the clearing watching this impossible horror unfold, understanding that I was going to die here, that no one would ever find my body or know what happened, that Jake was already dead or taken or transformed into something like the Skinwalker. And in my last moments, I would watch this creature wearing his face before it killed me too. But then I heard a voice, a third voice, calling my name from the tree line, and I turned and saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, and this figure was different from the others, was clearly human not creature, was an elderly Navajo man in traditional clothing, and he was chanting in a language I did not understand while holding up something that looked like a ceremonial staff or weapon. And the two fake Jakes recoiled from him, backing away and hissing like cornered animals, their transformations reversing as they tried to maintain the human disguise but failing, becoming more obviously monstrous with each second. The old man walked into the clearing still chanting, and he threw something into the air between me and the creatures, some kind of powder that caught the sunlight and seemed to hang in the air forming a barrier, and the creature shrieked and fled, moving with that impossible speed I had glimpsed before, and they were gone into the forest in seconds, leaving me alone in the clearing with the old man who was still chanting, still maintaining whatever protection he had created. He finished his chant and lowered his staff and looked at me with eyes that were both kind and infinitely sad, and he told me in perfect English that my brother was gone, taken by the Yinaldlushii 2 nights ago, while I slept, that what I had been traveling with for the past day was not Jake, but the Skinwalker wearing his shape, learning his mannerisms and speech patterns, preparing to take my shape as well, so it could return to civilization wearing our faces, and continue its hunting among unsuspecting populations. I fell to my knees and vomited, my body rejecting this information as completely as my mind could not accept it, and the old man waited patiently until I could stand again, and then he told me we needed to leave immediately, that the protection he had created would not last long, that the Skinwalker would return with others of its kind, and they would overwhelm even his power if we remained in this valley. I asked about Jake, begged to know if there was any chance my brother was still alive, if we could rescue him, and the old man shook his head and said that those taken by Skinwalkers were never seen again, were either killed immediately or transformed into Skinwalkers themselves through dark rituals that broke their minds and remade them as something no longer human, and that the kindest thing I could hope for was that Jake had died quickly on that first night rather than suffering transformation. We hiked out of the valley in silence, the old man leading and me following in numb shock, and he moved with a speed and sure-footedness that seemed impossible for his apparent age, never slowing or tiring even when the trail became steep and difficult, and I struggled to keep up, my body exhausted and my mind shattered by grief and trauma. We reached my truck just as the sun was setting, and the old man performed another ritual around the vehicle before allowing me to get in, sprinkling more of that powder and chanting and placing small objects made of feathers and stones at each wheel, and he told me to drive straight out of the mountains without stopping, to not look in my rearview mirror no matter what I saw or thought I saw, to drive until I reached the trading post in Shiprock, and to speak with Mrs. Begay, who was his daughter, and who would help me complete the protection. I asked him how he knew I was in danger, how he found me, and he explained that Mrs. Begay had sensed something wrong, had felt dark power awakening in the mountains where I had said we would camp, and she had asked him to go check on us, to make sure the foolish young people who had ignored her warnings were safe. And he had arrived too late to save my brother, but in time to save me, and he seemed genuinely sorry about that. Sorry that he had not come sooner. Sorry that I would carry this burden of survivor's guilt and unexplainable loss for the rest of my life. I drove out of the mountains as instructed, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they went numb, my eyes fixed on the road ahead, resisting the overwhelming urge to check the rearview mirror despite the sounds I heard coming from behind the truck. Sounds like something running alongside the vehicle at highway speeds, like claws scraping against metal, like voices calling my name in Jake's voice, and my mother's voice, and my own voice, trying to make me stop, trying to make me look back. I reached Shiprock just after midnight. The trading post closed, but with lights on in the attached residence, and Mrs. Begay came out before I even got out of the truck, as if she had been waiting for me, and her face when she saw I was alone told me that she understood what had happened, that she had seen this tragedy play out before with other foolish outsiders who ignored warnings and ventured into places they did not understand. She took me inside and performed cleansing rituals, burning more herbs and singing prayers and painting symbols on my skin with something that might have been ash or clay, and she gave me strong tea that tasted terrible, but that calmed my shaking and allowed me to think clearly enough to ask questions about what happened and what I should do now. Mrs. Begay explained that skinwalkers were witches who had gained their power through the worst kind of evil, through murdering family members and performing forbidden rituals that broke every taboo of Navajo culture, and that they could take the shape of any animal or person they chose by wearing the skin of that creature, actual physical skin taken from corpses or living victims, and that they used this power to harm others, to spread fear and chaos, to feed on suffering and death. She said that most skinwalkers operated alone, but that some formed packs or covens, and that the valley where Jake and I had camped was apparently home to such a group, a family of witches, who had been exiled from the tribe generations ago, and who had descended fully into darkness, becoming more monster than human, and that they guarded their territory jealously, and killed any outsiders who intruded. I asked about reporting Jake's disappearance to the police, about organizing a search and rescue operation, and Mrs. Begay gently explained that this would be useless, that the police would find nothing, that there would be no body to recover and no evidence of violence, that I would be suspected of murdering my own brother if I pushed too hard with wild stories about skinwalkers and shapeshifters, and that the best thing I could do was return home and tell my family that Jake died in a hiking accident, that he fell from a cliff or was attacked by an animal, anything that would give them closure without exposing them to the truth, which would destroy them. I spent 3 days in Shiprock recovering physically and mentally, staying in a small motel while Mrs. Begay and her father continued to perform protective rituals and teach me about what I had encountered and how to protect myself going forward. And during those days, I tried to process what had happened, tried to integrate the impossible into my understanding of reality, tried to figure out how to continue living with the knowledge that my brother was gone, and that I could never tell anyone the truth about how I lost him. Mrs. Begay gave me protective items to carry always, talismans and blessed objects that would ward off skinwalkers and other malevolent entities, and she taught me prayers in Navajo that I should recite when I felt threatened or afraid, and she made me promise that I would never speak Jake's name after sunset, would never call out to him hoping for a response, because skinwalkers could hear such calls and might come wearing his face to torment me or finish what they started. I drove back to Phoenix eventually, making the trip in a single day despite my exhaustion, needing to be home, needing to see my parents and figure out what to tell them about their missing son. I settled on a version that was partially true, that Jake and I had separated during a hike, that I had lost track of him, that by the time I realized he was not behind me and went back to search, he was gone, that I had spent hours looking and had eventually contacted authorities who conducted a search but found no trace, and my parents were devastated but believed me. Had no reason not to believe their daughter, who was so obviously traumatized by whatever had happened. The official search and rescue operation lasted 5 days. Teams combing the mountains where I claimed we had been hiking, though I gave them coordinates for a different location than where we had actually camped, led them to a safer area where skinwalkers did not hunt. And predictably they found nothing, no body, no evidence, no clues, and eventually the search was called off and Jake was presumed dead, killed by exposure or injury or animal attack in the vast wilderness that claimed several hikers every year. My parents held a memorial service without a body to bury, and friends and family gathered to remember Jake and support our grieving family, and I stood through it all in numb silence, unable to cry because the truth was too horrible for tears, unable to accept condolences because I knew that my arrogance and dismissal of warnings had led directly to my brother's death, unable to pray or find comfort in religion because I now knew that the world was far stranger and more dangerous than any theology acknowledged. I returned to university after taking a semester off to deal with the trauma, but I was changed, fundamentally altered by what I had experienced, unable to engage with normal student life that seemed so trivial compared to the reality I now knew existed just beyond the edge of civilization. I changed my major to anthropology with a focus on Native American studies, driven by a need to understand what I had encountered, to learn about skinwalkers and similar entities from indigenous cultures around the world, to maybe find some way to fight back or protect others from similar fates. My research led me deep into folklore and traditional knowledge that academia treated as mythology, but that I now recognized as descriptions of real phenomena, real dangers that modern skepticism had dismissed but not eliminated, and I began to understand that skinwalkers were just one type of many supernatural threats that existed in places where ancient power still held sway, where the land itself remembered older times and older rules. I earned my degree and then my master's degree, becoming an expert on Native American beliefs about shapeshifters and witchcraft, publishing papers that walked the line between academic analysis and true belief, careful never to explicitly state that I thought these entities were real, but writing in ways that suggested I took the tradition seriously as more than just cultural stories. I establish deep connections with indigenous communities, earning trust slowly by showing genuine respect and commitment to understanding rather than exploiting their knowledge. And through these connections I learned about other people who had encountered skinwalkers and survived, who carried the same burden of knowing that monsters were real, and that speaking this truth openly would result in being labeled crazy or delusional. Through these connections I eventually learned that Jake might not be dead, that there had been sightings over the years of a young white man living with a group of Navajo witches in the remote mountains, a man who moved and hunted like a skinwalker, but who sometimes showed signs of his original humanity, confusion and grief flashing across his face before the witch persona reasserted control. And I became obsessed with the possibility that my brother was still alive somewhere, trapped in a nightmare existence, but potentially savable if I could find him and somehow break the curse or dark magic that held him. This obsession drove me for years, led me on expeditions into dangerous territories, brought me into conflict with tribal authorities, who did not want outsiders meddling in matters they did not understand, led me to seek out shamans and medicine people who might have the power to reverse a skinwalker transformation, and through all of this I became harder, more knowledgeable, more capable of functioning in the spaces between normal reality and the hidden world of supernatural threats. I am 40 years old now, 16 years after losing Jake in those mountains, 16 years of searching and learning, and occasionally catching glimpses of what might be my brother running with a pack of skinwalkers through moonlit deserts, or watching from distant ridges with eyes that reflect light like an animal's eyes. And I still have not given up hope that somehow I can save him, can bring back the brother I lost, can undo the terrible consequences of our arrogant disregard for warnings that came from hard-earned wisdom. I know the chances are infinitesimal that even if Jake is alive, he may be too far gone to save, too completely transformed into something that is no longer my brother in any meaningful sense. But I cannot stop searching, because the alternative is accepting that I led him to a fate worse than death and then abandoned him to that fate, and that is a guilt I cannot live with. So I continue my work, documenting and researching, and occasionally fighting when necessary, protecting others from the mistakes Jake and I made, ensuring that fewer people have to learn the hard way that indigenous warnings about ancient evils are not superstition, but survival knowledge earned through generations of tragic experience. And sometimes, late at night when I am camping alone in remote areas doing my research, I hear footsteps circling my camp, and I hear my name being called in Jake's voice, and I have to resist the overwhelming urge to respond, to call back, to hope that maybe this time it really is my brother and not a creature wearing a shape. But I remember Mrs. Begay's warnings, and I stay silent, clutching my protective talismans and reciting prayers in Navajo. And I wait for dawn, when the skinwalkers must retreat to their dark places, and I survive another night. And I continue my search. And I hold on to hope, even as hope becomes thinner and more fragile with each passing year, because hope is all I have left of the brother I lost to my own arrogance in the mountains of New Mexico, where skinwalkers hunt and ancient curses are as real as the stones and trees and stars.